How to what?
Too many objects here.
Yeah, I know. I know it's my fault. It's drop all the papers in front of me.
And say when they do Q&A, we're going to have like a wandering mic, so if you can ask people to wait until they get them. And then these, I think you have to hold like
ripped up the core. The core was weak at Harvard. Used to have a very strong, that 2-year program here used to be good. Used to be good.
Colleagues, share colleagues. Okay. Welcome, everybody. I'm Steve Call. I'm the Dean of the Journalism School here and your moderator tonight. Thank you for coming. It should be a very interesting discussion. Good to see a good group here. I'm going to introduce the panelists, and then I'm going to introduce the discussion with just a very brief, some background about this complicated issue, at least on the U.S. side, a little bit complicated. And then we'll turn to a discussion among the four of us, the four of our panelists, and then before too long, we'll open it up to you for questions and your participation, I hope in the form of questions to the panelists rather than speeches or statements, but we'll welcome you in. And when that happens, because we're live streaming, we'll have a roving microphone, and I'll ask if you wouldn't mind waiting for that to arrive before you launch in. So at the far end of the panel is Chris Hedges. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, New York Times bestselling author, former, well, still occasional professor at Princeton and elsewhere at Rutgers, teaching in prison. We were talking about he's an activist and an ordained Presbyterian minister. He's written 11 books, including the New York Times bestseller Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, which he co-authored with the cartoonist Joe Sacco. And his book, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award for nonfiction, sold over 400,000 copies. That's good. He writes a weekly column for the website Truthdig in Los Angeles, and also hosts a show on RT America called On Contact. Next to him is Jeff Trimble. He's the Deputy Director of the U.S. Broadcasting Board of Governors. Before joining BBG, he worked for 10 years at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, where his positions included acting president, counselor to the president for programs and policy, and other strategy roles. And he previously was at U.S. News and World Report for 15 years, had both reporting and editing positions there. He has a master's and a bachelor's degree from Ohio State, and he's a fluent Russian speaker. Next to Jeff is Maria Snagova. Did I get it? All right. She's a PhD candidate at Columbia University, studying the sources of support for populist parties in Eastern Europe. Her PhD thesis compares the cases of Hungary and the Czech Republic and explains the popularity of Hungary's radical right Jobbik Party as a function of the economic policies of the mainstream parties and the lack of a radical left alternative. She contributes now to Russia's Vedomosti. Is that close? Yeah, it's a business daily, and to the Washington Post, the Huffington Post, National Interest, New Republic. Her main journalistic focus is Russia's domestic and foreign policy, nuances of its political system, and dynamics of contemporary autocracies. And then finally, next to me is Trevor Timm. He's the co-founder and executive director of the Freedom of the Press Foundation, journalist, activist, lawyer, whose writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, The Atlantic, USA Today, Politico, and can be read regularly in the Columbia Journalism Review. He worked previously at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and he helped longtime New York Times General Counsel James Goodall write a book about the Pentagon Papers, so probably doesn't like the Post. But that's all right.
It's a whole other panel.
It's a whole other panel. Okay. So the background I wanted to give, what brings us together is I hope we'll have a wide-ranging discussion about press freedom, Russia Today. But the particular case that organized this discussion, and thanks to Ann Cooper for doing all of this research and for organizing this event, involves a U.S. law that dates to 1938 and that was enacted to try to combat the perceived problem of pro-Nazi propaganda emanating from German institutions in the United States. So it was first passed in 1938. There were a couple of registrations forced during the Second World War, but later in the 1960s, the law was, and maybe again in the 90s, the law was amended really to emphasize registration of lobbyists rather than broadcasters. It has primarily been used as an instrument to regulate international lobbying. However, as we know, Russia and Russian information streams have been in the news over the last couple of years, and when I think the Directorate of National Intelligence, or the Director of National Intelligence, published its report on Russian activities during the 2016 presidential election. That was a report published a year ago, roughly January. It described Russia Today as an instrument of Russian influence, mentioned the network 27 times. And that, the following autumn, apparently led the Justice Department under the Trump administration to pressure RT to register as a foreign agent, which it did under protest, essentially, through an entity. And then Russia's government retaliated or responded by enacting its own registration requirements for U.S. entities, including those associated with the U.S. government under the BBG. So that's the background. The only other note that Ann and I have been wrestling with, trying to give you like some kind of fact statement at the beginning, I welcome dissents from the panel about the way I've described this, was that the actual thing that registered under protest this fall was a production company. And when we've looked at other state-funded broadcasters, like the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, Korean, Chinese, China Daily, we see some evidence that other news organizations, through complicated U.S. entities, have also registered over the years. Maybe on the advice of their lawyers. It's really not really clear. I don't think any of them has been, so far as we can see, warned by the Justice Department that they must. So maybe their lawyers just advised them it would be a good idea. But this system is kind of a mess. It's not only affecting RT, would be my summary. All right, so let me start our discussion by asking Chris, you have some affiliation with RT. What's been your experience of working with the network, and how inside the network, to the extent you had any acquaintance with it, was this pressure and this requirement received and kind of analyzed?
Well, let me just first begin as to why. Why do I have a show on RT? It's because the voices that I lift up, and I had previously had a show on Telesur IntelliSur collapsed and burned, with the Venezuelan economy tanking and Argentina going right wing, withdrawing 20% of the funding, etc. And RT had approached me to move the show there. I had done the show on IntelliSur for the same reason I do a show on RT, and that is because the media system in the United States, including public broadcasting, is essentially under corporate control. The kinds of voices that I attempt to lift up, anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist voices. I do a lot of shows on mass incarceration. I'm an open supporter of the boycott, divestment, sanction movement against Israel. This just puts me outside of the mainstream. And if we had a functioning public broadcasting system, these corporate critics, these imperialist critics, would have a voice. That is why a public broadcasting system exists. If you went back to the 1960s, you could see on public broadcasting figures such as Malcolm X, Noam Chomsky, who's been virtually blacklisted, Ralph Nader, James Baldwin, et cetera, and the parameter of acceptable opinion has now narrowed to such an extent, especially with the Koch brothers becoming such a major funder of public broadcasting, that the kinds of voices that I care about and the kinds of positions I, quote, quite openly support, very critical of the wars in the Middle East, very critical of the corporate coup d'etat, as John Ralston Saul calls it, that has eviscerated our democracy. I agree with the great political philosopher Sheldon Wolin. We have no institutions left that can be called authentically democratic, has pushed me on to RT America. But this is not as an anomaly. I mean, I work, for instance, in Eastern Europe when the only way in Czechoslovakia that anyone could hear the voice of Václav Havel was to listen to Voice of America. It's very clear as to why RT is giving someone like myself a platform, because that harsh critique of American empire and the corporate state is one that, they certainly, I think it's quite evident that should I be Russian and live in Russia, I would be a dissident, but it's one that we do overseas. I mean, I'll give you just an example. I covered the war in the former Yugoslavia, and I frequently gave voice to Serbian dissidents, especially from the Belgrade Circle, who were non-persons within their own society, but would appear on the front pages of the New York Times when I quoted them. Yet I was totally aware that the dissidents that I admired, like Chomsky, for instance, I think our greatest intellectual, had been virtually blacklisted from the paper that I worked for. That's why I'm there. I have to be completely candid and tell you that I do not own a television. And so I don't watch any TV. I'm a complete Luddite. I have 5,000 books in my house. I read every night. I don't even always watch my own show. So I'm not very good on RT, like I'm not good on any. The only time I ever see a cable news show is when I'm at the gym, and that just thrusts me into even deeper despair, or an airport. I mean, especially CNN, which has become burlesque, and MSNBC, all of them. I mean, it's a carnival act. It's not news. It's gossip. They make a lot of money off of it, but it's the degradation of journalism, the collapse of print, which is economic, that inability of print, or the monopoly they once had to connect sellers and buyers is gone, 40%. So I look at the state of American journalism as one, certainly within my own trajectory, going back 3 decades, as one that's collapsed. And so that's why I'm at RT. I do the show in New York. I pick the guests. I've never had any interference. To be quite frank, they knew what they were getting because I had done this for 2 years for IntelliSur. Thank you.
So, Jeff, I mean, let's paint a picture on the other side from your experience at RFE and RL and now at the BBG. What's been the trajectory of constraint on broadcasting in Russia, but also elsewhere around the world, and how does this episode, what does it portend for your work?
Sure, thanks, Steve. I'm really delighted to be here. Thanks for inviting me as a journalist. Myself, for more than 3 decades, I probably have more questions than answers, which is, I guess, why I went into journalism. This is just such a rich set of topics that we can discuss this evening that I really am looking forward to a good discussion. So in the case of the U.S. international broadcasters, which when we're talking about Russia is Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and the Voice of America, there are 3 other taxpayer-funded international broadcasters that we have. We have Radio Free Asia. We have the Middle East Broadcast Networks, which is our Arabic language broadcaster. By the way, RT is doing very well in the Middle East with its Arabic language channel. Their numbers are really good. And we have the Office of Cuba Broadcasting, which is focused specifically on Cuba. But to speak specifically about Russia, we were speaking before the start of the program, and I recall meeting Misha Sokolov, who is still in the Moscow Bureau of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, way back when I was the Moscow correspondent for U.S. News and World Report magazine, and when Ann Cooper was there as the NPR correspondent. And Misha already was reporting for Radio Liberty from the Soviet Union before the collapse of the Soviet Union. He was doing reports for Radio Liberty. After the August coup in 1991, President Yeltsin issued a decree, a presidential decree, allowing Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty to open a bureau in Moscow, ordering the Russian Foreign Ministry to issue accreditations to Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty correspondents, and to permit them to rent a facility in Moscow and set up a bureau. In 2002, and I'm going to double check that, it might be 2006, but I think it's 2002, President Putin revoked that decree. In the history of the Russian Federation, only one presidential decree has been revoked by a subsequent Russian president. That's the one. It was for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Now, they were able to continue the bureau at that point. By that point, they were registered and operating there. I guess what I should say, just by way of summary, is if what has been done since the FARA registration requirements here by the Russian government, if that reciprocity really was the only thing that had been done, I'd actually be a pretty happy guy. Because what we've looked at in terms of our operations, and certainly this is true for Russian media outlets and civil society as well, is a steady, deepening crackdown going back to the early 2000s, but heightening. Just a couple of more things about our operations there. In 2005, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and the Voice of America had approximately 100 media outlets across the Russian Federation that were carrying our programming in some kind of affiliation relationship, either television programs from VOA or radio programs for the most part from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. That was 100 in 2005. Now it's 0. There may be 1 or 2 that are picking up a program here and there, probably not news content stuff, and putting it on, but we have no systematic partnerships at this time for distribution of our content in the Russian Federation. It is available in the digital space. Certainly all the tools are in place, both legislative and technical, for the Russians to shut that down, the digital space, if they chose to do so. They have done that in one instance with our websites thus far, and that is in occupied Crimea, where the Russians blocked for some time a trilingual website that Radio Free Europe set up following the Russian takeover of Crimea, called Crimea Realities. It's a Russian, Ukrainian, Crimean Tatar website that was been blocked by the Russians. But as I say, if we want to go dive further into this and look specifically at all the things that have been done, there are a whole set of things and regulations and laws that have been put in place that we're reckoning with, and what has been done now in terms of registration as foreign agent is just the last thing in that. And just to cap, I'd say we still don't have all the details of what exactly that will entail. The Justice Ministry hasn't yet issued the final specific instructions about what precisely we need to do in order to comply with their foreign agent registration law.
So, yeah, Maria, you've been covering this, so if you wanted to say a little bit more about what you understand the response in Russia to be. And can I ask you something else as well, if you have something to say about it? How does, and Jeff, you can jump in too, you may know the answer to this, what does Russia today mean in Russia to Russians? I mean, in Britain, BBC means something. In Canada, CBC means something. Is it visible? Does it have a domestic constituency of any sort outside the government?
I don't honestly think that Russia Today means a lot to Russians, since it's mostly designed to broadcast abroad. So if any coverage is available to the Russians, and since it's a free, typically it may be achieved through different means, if you want to download an application on your phone, for example. But the majority of Russians really do not watch Russia Today, so it's a separate story. Russians have a whole set of other propaganda tools at their disposal, such as ORT, RTR, the state-funded channels, and TV, etc. Essentially, the absolute majority of any kind of TV channels right now is in one way or another representing the Kremlin, a viewpoint for the domestic audience. And those are also the channels that are available and broadcast in the nearest abroad. So they are also very outside of Russia Today. They are very influential in shaping the opinion of the Russian-speaking population in Russia's nearest abroad, like the post-communist and post-Soviet space. Now, when it comes to the foreign agent laws in Russia, so I have to emphasize there are actually at least three different sets of laws that are taking place. So first of all, the nearest analog parallel to FARA would be the 2012 Foreign Agents Law. That was passed by the Kremlin as response to the Russia's protests, countrywide 2011-2012 protests, as broadly this continuation of an attempt of destroying any kind of, NGO or grassroots mobilization. The idea is essentially very close to FARA. If you look at it formally, the main criteria for an NGO to be labeled as a foreign agent is it has to be funded from abroad, has some kind of foreign funding, and be engaged in political activity. This is very similar to what FARA defines as a foreign agent, except, and the devil is always in the details, as you know, political activity, according to the Kremlin, can be described as literally anything. Us sitting here and talking can literally be constructed as a political activity in Russia. Precedents include describing as a political activity conducting polls, essentially studying Russians' public opinion, publishing the results of these polls, in some occasions even having some books in the libraries. Those NGOs were labeled as foreign agents based on having some books which was constructed as a political activity. That is a separate law, and if the Russian government decides that you are a foreign agent according to this law, you'll be demanded to put this label foreign agent on any publication that you issue. And the difference here is also important that agent, the word agent, in Russian means something different than it means in English. It actually literally means a spy in most cases. So you may imagine that Russia's NGOs and public opinion polls companies were extremely reluctant to put this label on their publications because, of course, given Russia's Cold War history and the Soviet past and legacy, this immediately constructs them as enemies of the state. But just to continue, this is the first essentially response and the nearest analog to the FARA. But in response to essentially labeling RT as a foreign agent in the United States, this fall, Russia's Duma, not being satisfied by what it already had at its disposal, introduced the amendments to Russia's media law. This is a direct response to this FARA ruling. And the interesting thing is that these amendments now require any media that gets funding from abroad, and this is described in extremely vague terms, so from abroad may be anything, individuals, states, international organizations, even people without any citizenship. Those media can be labeled as foreign agents. Notice there's no mentioning of any political activity here. And even if you are CNN Sports, essentially broadcasting about the sports, you still can be described as a foreign agent media according to this law. This, of course, creates all kind of legal issues because no one knows what it means. And as I've actually tried to speak to my colleagues in Russia who work at Voice of America or Radio Free Europe, those are media outlets that are already described as foreign agent media. They have no idea what it means and essentially what it's going to be. Apparently, they will be later made subject to the earlier foreign agent law that I mentioned.
Let me just bring Trevor in. Thank you. So it used to be at least the declared position of the United States that it supported press freedom around the world. This administration, not so much, at least rhetorically. And so what are the consequences of this in a global context?
Yeah, I mean, I think bringing up Donald Trump is a great point. What FARA essentially does is give the U.S. government the ability to decide what is and isn't journalism. You know, you don't have to necessarily like RT or Sputnik Radio to understand the dangers of this type of precedent. You know, as you mentioned in your introduction, FARA has been around for 80 years and, you know, decades in its current form. Only a handful of state-owned media organizations have registered in the past, and probably it was because of overly cautious lawyers. We don't really know of a case where the Justice Department has threatened on force of arrest for a media organization to register like this. And so you can you know, number one, if you have a law on the books that is being used for political retribution rather than applied evenly and openly across the spectrum, you open the government up to using this law for political retribution against governments that they may not like and allowing governments that they do like to slide through. You know, Donald Trump, I mean, I think a year ago this would be a little bit more of a far-fetched example, but you know, Donald Trump creates some sort of riff with a random country virtually every week by tweeting. And he has already threatened 2 U.S. news organizations with vague regulatory retaliation. So he's told CNN, or you know, they've made claims that he's going to use antitrust law to stop the Time Warner merger because he doesn't like CNN, and he has threatened the broadcast licenses of NBC because he didn't like a report that NBC put out. So you can entirely imagine Donald Trump getting into a fight with one of our allies or maybe one of our adversaries and saying, I'm going to invoke FARA against your state-owned media organization, of which there are dozens and dozens in the U.S. And so when you get into the business of the U.S. government deciding what is and isn't journalism, I think that's very dangerous, given that you know, the First Amendment has given journalists in this country a unique freedom where the government doesn't decide who a journalist is in normal situations and doesn't license them as such.
Obviously, it creates a model that anybody anywhere can use using the U.S. as an example.
Yeah, and that's not even getting into the international implications.
Right. So I assume that none of us on this panel, none of you on the panel, wishes to argue that it was a good thing to force Russia Today to register. We weren't able to find someone who was willing to come onto the panel who wanted to take that position. During Anne's research, she came across something that Jeff mentioned as well, which was a report in the Atlantic Council, by the Atlantic Council, which is kind of a think tankish group in Washington, that put out like a really long argument in favor at some point last year or this year, last year. So just for the sake of diversity of opinion, Anne, I was going to ask you just to like summarize what it was that they argued. What would be the best possible rationale for doing this, according to them? Okay.
I actually have some of the quotes from the report because I think it's important to hear their words. And we did invite both the author of the report and the person who wrote the foreword to it to come, but they both declined to be here, said that they had other things to do. So this report came out a few months after the U.S. intelligence report about Russian attempts at interference in the elections. And I should say also that the intelligence report did not call for registration of RT, even though it was highly critical of RT and said it was, you know, one of the weapons used by the Kremlin in its efforts during the elections. The Atlantic Council said RT needed to be registered to alert the public to Russia's efforts and to limit Russia's ability to masquerade its information warfare as legitimate media activity. They called RT a tool of Russian political influence designed to spread disinformation and undermine Western values. Those are the common charges that are made about RT. And the council, it was a pretty lengthy and very, law-based, or the research was based on the law and trying to make the argument legally, this is why RT should register. And it said in the report that it would not violate free speech to force RT to register, since RT could continue its operations here. They said instead it serves the First Amendment by supplementing information available to the public.
Right, and of course the law apparently also requires a registered media entity to label its own news or content as propaganda or as state-sponsored. What is it that you're supposed to say?
Not as propaganda, but you're registered.
You're registered. So let's talk about the underlying idea that societies need to be protected from unpopular opinions, because of course what I think all have outlined here is that bad law is made by unpopular defendants, but the premise that the United States today or the Soviet Union in the 1980s was vulnerable to political change or collapse or interference from outside because of news that originated at companies outside of the country, it obviously has caused both this government today and also past and current Russian governments to respond with restrictions, because apparently somebody's worried about it. But what does history tell us about this?
The attack on RT is made explicit in the January 6th Director of National Intelligence report. It's only 22 pages. I urge you to read it. Because when it attacks RT, it attacks them for giving a voice to Black Lives Matter, for giving airtime to third-party candidates, for, in their words, asserting that the two-party system does not represent the views of at least a third of the population, for characterizing the United States as a surveillance state, for reporting on widespread infringements of civil liberties, police brutality, drone use, criticism of the U.S. economic system. This is all from the report. Pages of it, over a third of it, is dedicated to RT America. I mean, first of all, we should acknowledge that RT America has a very marginal media footprint. You don't have very many people watching RT America, and so it's clear. And if you watch actually after the Clapper testified in the hearings, Ralph Nader called me up and he said, "You got to watch it because it's not so much what he says, but watch the venom." And I think what's happened is that neoliberalism, globalization, this ideology where we configured our society around the dictates of the marketplace has lost credibility across the political spectrum. You saw it with the insurgencies in the two political parties. And ramping up this Russian hysteria is a way of diverting, by the elites, diverting attention from what it is that has caused the deep unrest in the United States, and that is grotesque levels of social inequality. And so by those of us who've already been pushed to the margins, I write for a website out of LA run by Bob Scheer, who used to be the editor of Ramparts, but we don't have much, I mean, us as critics, we're already on the fringes. And now I think that what's happening with this Russian witch hunt, if you look closely at Mueller, by the way, everything, at least from what we can gather, that he's going after in terms of the Trump empire has nothing to do with Russian interference in the elections. It has to do with money laundering and fraud, and the story is through Cypriot banks, Russian oligarchs funneled money into the Trump machine, into real estate deals, and that's probably real. I'm not surprised to anyone in this room, especially if you've been down to Atlantic City, this guy's mobbed up, and always has been. And so what we saw with this hysteria was in April, Google, Facebook, begin to impose algorithms to block fake news, as they called it. And this has devastated the websites that I write for and that run my stuff. So I write for TruthDig, as I mentioned, and so Google referrals from Google, so if you type in a word like imperialism or something, have gone down from the beginning of last year, 721,000 to 246,000. Alternet has had its traffic drop by 63%. The World Socialist website, and I just went out to Detroit to do an event, a live stream event with them, has dropped by 85%. And so these are not disconnected.
You think that it's your ideas that are getting trapped in the algorithm that was constructed for Sputnik or something?
No,
or is it
it's
words
that
or keywords?
If you had typed in mass incarceration or something, before these algorithms were in place, it would have given you articles from Alternet, TruthDig, Counterpunch. These are all left-wing sites that have been affected. Of 145 terms, the World Socialist website, which is a Trotskyite organization out of Detroit, which has tracked it, of 145 terms, and they have the figures that used to bring traffic, they now get 0. They've actually put in names like Julian Assange, stuff like this. And these algorithms, we just had a hearing last Wednesday, and which I urge everyone to look at. They're quite upfront about creating these mechanisms to block content. And Google, Facebook, these are entities that are intertwined with the security and surveillance state. So that can't be separated from this attack on RT itself.
Right. So, Jeff, let me bring you in real quickly here, because let's go back to the principles. You must argue all around the world in defense of the rights of U.S. government-funded broadcasters to operate in countries, that the benefits and principles that you must have to defend in lots of different settings. So what principles should govern us, not just in managing international broadcasters that want to broadcast television, but on social media platforms and in this kind of period of argument about what constitutes dangerous propaganda, if anything?
So one reason I do what I do and why I got into this is that I really believe that free societies have nothing to fear from the free flow of information. Unfree societies do. Radio Liberty went on the air the week Joseph Stalin died. Several decades later, the Soviet Union collapsed. Did people listening to Radio Liberty and doing things with the information they picked up there and sharing that information contribute in some way to the collapse of the Soviet Union? Well, if you'd ask the likes of Václav Havel and Andrei Sakharov and Lech Wałęsa, they would actually say yes, it did. And that's the free flow of information. So it gets at the principles that we stand for as a society. It's not about the policies of any particular administration, and the law that governs U.S. international broadcasting is very explicit about that. It's very explicit, saying that by doing good journalism, by telling America's story in all of its richness and diversity, and oh my gosh, we had a lot of richness and diversity in the last year to talk about around the world in 61 languages, and to present and discuss American policy in a responsible way, presenting all sides to the story, that represents something about who we are. Again, it's not about the policies of a particular administration. It's about the bigger picture, and the law under which we operate is very explicit about that. So that's what we take forward in what we do. And of course, it's not just about the international broadcasters. First and foremost, it's about the domestic media in the countries themselves. Seeing Joel Simon here from Committee to Protect Journalists and the fabulous work that they do to defend and protect and stand up for independent journalists and for journalists trying to do free, responsible journalism around the world is so incredibly important. And to some extent, what we do contributes to that as well.
So, Maria, you've done some of your PhD work on populist parties in Hungary and Central Europe. And what is the role of the free flow of digital information, social media platforms, attempts to use 4chan or 8chan to spread memes and narratives, false, true, or misleading. Is it really important to the political atmosphere that you've studied?
Before I answer that question, can I just quickly counter Mr. Hedges' viewpoint? So, just in defense of the Atlantic Council report, since I can see there's not as many supporters here, the main problem, my reading of the report was, the main problem with RT is that it was very unclear about its funding sources, not per se with the narrative or the coverage that it provides. The coverage was discussed only with regards to its being engaged in the political activity. But the main issue is that RT tried to argue it's a publicly funded broadcasting outlet, like BBC or Deutsche Welle. And we know for a fact it is not. It's getting funds quite directly from the Russian Federation. But RT consistently refused to disclose the sources of its financing, despite being repeatedly asked to do so. This is where the main puzzle lies. Was RT clearer with regards to that issues? Maybe it would have never found itself in such a controversial situation.
But there are other broadcasters that are funded directly by governments, right?
That's a different story. But I mean, the report deals primarily with the sources of funding. And even if I definitely support the idea of being able to provide your alternative opinion to the U.S. audience, the question is whether we should really do so on a public outlet that's funded by the government, that's openly hostile to the U.S. national interests. That's a different question. I think that should be asked here. Now, when it comes to the populists, of course, in these days, the media flow is a really important issue. And in a lot of ways, what RT is doing may be compared to the radical right parties, what they are doing in the countries of my interest. Very often, the convergence of, and this is where I think Mr. Hedges was right, I agree with him, the convergence of the mainstream establishment, media, or politicians on some agenda that is not representative of the interest of some groups of the population creates this vacuum, which ends up being filled by these non-traditional, say, entities, be it media entities, or radical right parties, political activists, who actually appeal to those groups, very often blue-collar workers or groups hurt by globalization who find themselves marginalized in the current economic political system. They appeal to those groups from this perspective of not being, heard, not being respected. And of course, they find this way a lot of support. There's a niche for them out there. Let me remind you that RT actually started on a different PR, with a different PR strategy. It started in 2005, trying to portray Russia's policies as good and benevolent and great, right? But it was not really interesting to the Western audience in that capacity. It only when RT switched towards being representative of these non-traditional, non-conventional, or very often conspiracy viewpoints and reaching out to those marginalized groups, it is that strategy that actually gained them support. This is completely parallel to what radical right parties and populist parties are doing in Central Eastern Europe.
So, Trevor, just before we open it up to the audience, you were at EFF. When you think about free speech, free media in a global context, in the age of social media platforms and all of this argument about bots and manipulation, where you may have computers generating manufactured content for commercial purposes in some cases, for ideological purposes in other cases. So how pure a purist are you? Do you think that there is, in Europe we see the rise of some regulation. There was a lot of anxiety around the French election, the German election. There's a different attitude toward privacy and the requirements of corporations in European regulation that's already emerged. Europe may be the place that challenges the monopoly power of the Silicon Valley platforms, certainly unlikely to happen here. So what should we as citizens think about the role of government in trying to bring this system to a different place? How hands-off do you think all government should be? And if they should intervene, what should they intervene against? If not content, then what?
Well, I think it's a tough question, but when you look at the First Amendment itself, we look at as journalists look at the First Amendment as a shining beacon throughout the world. But we also have to understand that there are costs to that. We think that the benefits outweigh those costs. And sometimes those costs are terrible speech, or speech we don't like, or misleading speech, even lies. We have made different calculations than Europe has, than almost every other country has in the world. But once you start going down the road of regulating speech, forcing media organizations to label themselves, you go down a road that may be hard to stop. One of the big arguments in this Atlantic Council paper that everybody's citing was that using FARA isn't actually censorship. You force somebody to label the content that they produce, but nobody is stopping them from producing it. Well, a week after RT was registered under FARA, they lost their congressional press pass. The association that gives out the press passes cited their registration under FARA as a reason. Now, there are dozens and dozens of other state news outlets that have press passes, even some that are registered under FARA. And so, using a law like this as retribution against even an organization which many of us might find distasteful can lead us down a road that could potentially be very dangerous. And I think that people need to look at this issue not from the Russian interference investigation and scandal, but from the idea that this precedent could be very worrying when it's used against others.
Well, I just wanted to kick in. Of course, journalists around the world every day labor ahead in the face of extensive inhibitions and restrictions on what they do. There are laws all over the place and restrictions that exist for journalists, and they figure out how to do their best given those restrictions. In many countries, you cannot report about election news. There's a blackout right before the election, and journalists are expected to observe that. There are registrations and accreditations and insult laws and all kinds of things with which journalists have to make do every day. When it comes to our operations in a place like Russia, for instance, we're simply committed to doing independent, fact-based journalism despite any barriers that might be put up, any registrations or throwing us out of the country or whatever. We are going to continue to do what we do, just as journalists have to do around the world. So I think it's unrealistic to anticipate that there ever would be an environment in which there are absolute guarantees of free speech that are reinforced. The realities are actually very different than that. I think we all have to take that into account as we're doing our work.
So we have that microphone. And John, can I call on you for a second and inform me that you're just back from Moscow? Is that a true fact? All right. So did you go visit RT while you were there?
Yes, I had an interview with Margarita Nazarov.
Okay, can you tell us about that and how this whole episode is playing out there these days?
Well, it's funny because the points that the panelists are making some of them are very much like she did. She also cited the congressional accreditation being taken away and said that it's going to be harder for them to get Americans to work for their network, and that their commercial partners won't want to deal with them. And I sort of put to her the idea that you just mentioned that, well, there are barriers to international reporting all over, but you're still not stopped from going anywhere and talking to people who are willing to talk to you. But she very much was of the opinion that this was a violation of America's credo for freedom of speech, and really did not give an inch even on the subject of whether or not they were subject to Kremlin influence. So as she described it, she said that, basically she sets the rules and no one can interfere with her. So take that as you will.
Can I just
respond? It was a good interview. It was a very interesting read.
Yeah. So a couple of those points. I think the point you brought up is a good one in the sense that, I think missing from this discussion is the fact that this plays right into Russian and Putin's hands. They now get to play the victim. It's interesting to look at media coverage of RT before the election and after the election. When there was a profile of RT in American media, in 2015 and 2014, it was obvious. It was almost always made up of mockery and derision. The fact that their ratings were so low that Nielsen and the other companies that do ratings on cable television couldn't even track them. The average RT show got less than 30,000 viewers. And then, cut to after the election, there have been dozens and dozens of profiles talking about how RT is the greatest menace to America and Putin's victory over all of us. And it's funny and ironic when you go and read these articles and they talk about RT's huge reach across the United States and across the world. They use numbers from RT press releases based on studies that they commissioned that are wildly exaggerated. And it's, and then they cite, the YouTube numbers of subscribers and their Facebook likes and their Twitter followers. And without even mentioning that, there's dozens and dozens of other stories about how Russians have all these troll farms, which they build up followers on. And so, the media is essentially trying to have it both ways, where the facts and reality is that Russia today has far less reach than anybody is giving it credit for now, but they can't seem to put those two and two together.
Right. Okay. So questions from this side of the room or that side of the room? Yes. Wait.
It's a shame that you didn't have a skilled arguer for the pro point of view. I'm not suggesting that it would have merit, but of course it would have been added spice to the discussion if you had. So I'd like to offer 2 points that any of you might use as surrogates for the arguers who aren't here. One would be the relevance of Walter Lippmann's theory of how democracy functions, which is based upon a pyramidal scheme of interpretation from presumably the doyens who know to people who know less and filtering down to the common man who Lippmann decided really couldn't understand a whole lot on his own. That's point one. The second we see with other networks that have a substantial reputation for bias, such as Fox News, which is the separation of news and editorial. And it's been suggested, for example, that Fox is, by some anyway, close to being an honest broker as far as reporting the news, while they are, of course, wildly enthusiastic of their own agenda in the editorial content, such as you, Chris, are involved in with RT. So I'm just offering these as points from which you can fashion your own semantic networks or explanations to fill in for the people who aren't here.
Okay, well, let's take another question. Yes.
Hi, this question is for Chris Hedges. You wrote a column in 2016 called America the Illiterate, which talked about the intellectual stratification of the United States. With the narrative of fake news and Russian interference that's dominated our media landscape, do you believe that the majority of Americans have the ability to separate fact from fiction?
Well, increasingly less, because the media landscape is awash in conspiracy theories and fake news that don't come from RT, but come from Breitbart and Fox News and Stormfront and all. And then we haven't even mentioned the Christian right, which is hermetically sealed, certainly tens of millions of people in magic Jesus land, where Adam and Eve put saddles on the back of a T-Rex. That's what you see when you visit the Creationist Museum in Peterborough, Kentucky, and that's, that column, it kind of is a much shorter synopsis of a longer thesis that I have in my book Empire of Illusion, The End of Literacy and the Triumph of Spectacle. And I think that, Guy Debord kind of nailed it. And when I see, especially let's turn to electronic media, it's all spectacle all the time. It's all a carnival act. And CNN is, they made $1 billion a year off of that. They are the great enabler of Trump. They were the enabler of Trump, and they are the enabler of Trump. And when news is primarily, I think the two things that have destroyed news in particular in the airwaves is one, it's valued solely for its ability to elicit an emotional response, and two, in these big media corporations, Viacom, General Electric, they're a revenue stream. News is a revenue stream. It's not like the old Hearst media empire, and Hearst, was not adverse to fake news. It's how he plunged us into the Spanish-American War. But now you have a large corporation where these news divisions compete against dozens, if not hundreds, of revenue streams. And they're solely judged on their ability to create revenue. And this is very dangerous and very frightening. And I think that, we have become a society of spectacle. And Trump is a creation. He's a creation of Zucker, who at NBC, who created this fictional persona on The Apprentice that Trump used to, sell himself as a viable presidential candidate. And there was quite a good, quite frank, but very terrifying interview with him in the New York Times Magazine a few weeks ago, where he talked about how he models CNN on ESPN, including putting the hosts outside. So you bring in Van Jones on one side, and you bring in some troll from, whose sole qualification to be on air is that he's an idiot and a racist, and will support Trump. But this has nothing to do with news. And the corrosion within news is what's given us a Trump. And I don't know how to fight against it. But yes, I find it absolutely terrifying. And you can just see through Pew polls and everything else the insane kinds of things that Americans believe.
Jeff, you said that free societies have nothing to fear. Do you, as an American, and you talked about how authoritarian societies do, but as an American, do you still feel that way? I mean, you may come to your conclusion down a different path from Chris, but do you still stand by your conviction?
Time will tell. I think that the decades have proven this to be a pretty resilient society, so time will tell. I certainly acknowledge that it looks particularly complex and challenging at the moment. I also, having said what I said about believing in free society's ability to deal with these things, I would not want to give the impression that I'm in any way blasé about what the Russians are trying to do in the information space. And frankly, RT is just a tiny bit of sand on the beach of this effort. We focus on RT because we speak English and we look at what it says and we find that kind of interesting. What we focus on more in U.S. international broadcasting is providing an alternative, first and foremost, in the Russian language, to the multi-billion-dollar Kremlin juggernaut of its Russian domestic media channels that are being watched around the world. This is very serious stuff. And then, of course, we get to the next layer down, which I guess I would use the language that the German Marshall Fund has coined, and I think is very successful, about what they term information laundering, which consists of 3 stages. First is placement. You post misleading information on a website or a social media account. The second part of laundering is layering, which is the spread of disinformation from its point of origin to more credible sources. And the third point is integration, which is the point at which disinformation is adopted by credible news sources or widely disseminated by real users on social media platforms. If you don't think this is an issue, then you do have a problem. This is a big issue, and I'm not saying the Russians are the only ones who do it. They happen to be the ones I study because it's the closest to the world in which I'm operating. But
we've got to, as Americans, acknowledge the $2.5 billion we gave to shove Boris Yeltsin down the throats of Russia. The constant media, I mean, the money which was done through an IMF loan of $10 billion, we fixed that election. And we used our propaganda and our resources to put him in office. And that's just a historical fact. I spent 20 years overseas. I watched the American, both through dark arts and, very manipulation, from the Central America to the Middle East. So the idea that we somehow have clean hands, I wouldn't dispute anything you say about a Russian attempt to interfere to promote their interests within the United States. All countries do that. We do that. I just think that essentially by creating a Russia witch hunt, which is propelled primarily out of the Democratic Party, it's very dangerous to not acknowledge the fact that it is the rise of an oligarchic state, the paralysis of our democratic systems, and deep social inequality. And I hope the Democrats wake up because, as Chomsky said, we as distasteful as Trump is, Pence is probably worse. And I think, the tragedy for me at this historical moment is that if Clinton didn't have $1 billion from Goldman Sachs and she hadn't rigged the DNC, I think Sanders would have beat Trump. And we better start acknowledging that social inequality instead of allowing the Democratic Party to spin, throw this snake oil in our face, or we're going to be in big trouble.
Couple more questions. Yes, you in the back. Just please wait for the microphone. She's moving as fast as she can.
Hi. So, when are journalists foreign agents? I'm assuming like this is a point of concern insofar as like a foreign agent can influence a society through media, right? To what extent do you feel like this conversation is happening because of self-inflicted wounds by the American media? So this is not, I don't want to like assert an opinion on it, but polling would suggest that, right or wrong, this institution is the least respected in America and is not trustworthy. At some polls, I think Gallup had even shown that Americans trust politicians more than media. So
not Congress. We're still in second to last.
Oh. So to what extent do you think that issues with American media itself and perhaps people in the field of journalism maybe ignoring it has played a role in the relevancy of this conversation? And maybe one other quick question. I'm a programmer, and so I spend a lot of my time looking at technology and thinking about technology because I don't have anything better to do. And I've noticed that the longer information is available to one person, the more likely it will be available to everyone. So do you guys agree? And if so, do you think that in the arc of history, that phenomena will make the concern of a journalist potentially acting as a foreign agent irrelevant?
Well, I think we called the panel, "When is a journalist a foreign agent?" because of the specific episode in which RT was required to register as a foreign agent, and that has a kind of effect on both the freedom of the press in this country potentially and globally. So I think that's where we started. But on your core question, is the media unpopular because the media is seen by the public as not performing its constitutional role adequately or being polluted by spectacle or of course. And the thing is that if you look at that polling, the Gallup polling, Pew polling, the media has never been popular as an institution in the United States in the era of modern polling, but it's gotten worse, definitely. And so I guess I would just stop there. The other question, unless there's a computer programmer who can talk about network effects, maybe we'll leave that for the after party. Okay, 2 more questions and then we'll let you go.
Hi. Yeah, coming from Europe, we have a slightly looser relationship with the idea of government regulating the media than you guys do here, but we don't have Trump, I guess. So if you just kind of assume, for the sake of argument, that the idea of government regulating, what isn't journalism is a bad idea, is there anything short of that we can do about this? Because, aside from this question, I have a hard time having a problem with readers of the media being told that RT, while it does good and important journalism on some things, is in other ways propaganda with a very clear motive. I also have a hard time with the idea of media consumers not knowing that Radio Free or Radio Liberty is funded by the US government. I mean, practically short of conversations about agents and spies and the FBI and the Justice Department, is there something that we can do? Or is this something we should just leave to the marketplace of ideas to figure out?
Okay, let's just take the last question and then we'll let the panelists respond to those and anything else they want to conclude with.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. Chris earlier on talked about what is essentially Google censorship and how some left-wing websites are essentially being disappeared from Google searches. I also remember hearing something along the lines of Facebook changing the way news appears in its feed and how they're prioritizing family content, connections, and what have you, as opposed to news information, news media, and other things, in an effort to do away with divisiveness. I was just hoping Chris could maybe talk about how insidious and advanced this campaign is, this corporate governmental campaign to censor information, and what are left-wing organizations and websites doing about that?
Well, I mean, with the abolition of net neutrality, it essentially hands the government the ability to destroy free speech. And I urge you all to go back and look at the hearings at the U.S. Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation last Wednesday. This is Monica Beckert. She's the head of global policy management at Facebook. And she told the committee that Facebook employs a security team of 10,000 people, 7,500 of whom access potentially violating content, and that by the end of 2018, that security team will double to 20,000. That these social media companies, as I mentioned before, are intertwined. Bezos has a $650 million contract with the CIA. Beckert told the committee, I'm quoting, that the team includes, quote, a dedicated counterterrorism team of former intelligence and law enforcement officials and prosecutors who worked in the area of counterterrorism. She told the committee that artificial intelligence automatically flags questionable content. Facebook, she said, does not, quote, wait for these bad actors to upload content to Facebook before placing it into our detection systems. These are her words. The propaganda that Facebook blocks, she said, is, quote, is content that we identify ourselves before anybody else can see it. And she said that along with over a dozen other social media companies, they have already created a blacklist of 50,000 unique digital fingerprints that never appear online. And we, on the left, are part of that. And so I think that when we talk tonight about going after RT, which has virtually no media footprint, if you can't figure out that RT's funded by the Russian government, it's called Russia Today. There's nothing particularly hidden about it. But I look at what's happened with going after RT in conjunction. These are all the sites that run my stuff. And that's not accidental. And of course, net neutrality has become the weapon, one, through the, charging, putting people for money into a faster lane, slowing down left-wing sites, and they already, through these algorithms, are, through impressions, through the particular words that you type in, diverting traffic. This is eviscerated. I don't know if anyone reads Alternet. It's a good site. Truthdig's traffic is down significantly. And I find this trend very, very ominous. How are we going to recover net neutrality? How are we going to turn Google into the internet into a public utility? I don't know much about digital technology. Can we do that city by city? But if we don't do something, and you're right, they will essentially block us out. It's thought police. It's what they call de-ranking, or counter thought. The counter thought is a word that she used, so that when people seek they'll actually send them something to make them to push them to think something else, to adopt an opinion that, in their words, is not damaging or radical. Yes, these are being used against jihadist websites without question, but that beggars the whole question. I spent 7 years in the Middle East as to why are people joining ISIS, and it's not because of Facebook. It happens to the fact that we've been dropping iron fragmentation bombs on them for over a dozen years, and they don't like being occupied any more than we would. So I think that it's extremely serious, this moment in history, and we are watching a very aggressive campaign by the elites to essentially snuff out. And I think, as I said before, it's because they no longer have a counter argument. Nobody is buying their neoliberal ideology that allowing the dictates of the marketplace, which defies 5,000 years of human history.
So, Chris, just in the interest of time, if I just want to give our colleagues a chance to make a closing statement. So, Jeff, why don't you? Do you want to respond to the question or anything else?
Point here. We in U.S. International Broadcasting are extremely concerned and have expressed our concerns about breaking news out of the social feeds. And we share that concern with BBC, Deutsche Welle, the French International Broadcasting, the Dutch, the Japanese, and the Australians. Together we call ourselves the DG7. And we're very concerned that by doing so, it's going to make it much easier for closed societies, for dictatorships, to block that, to keep that content away from people if it's separated out of the feed. So we're deeply concerned about that, and we're going to be speaking about that publicly, as well as continue to engage with Facebook and Google and others on that issue.
Maria, any closing thoughts?
The reason RT is called RT and not Russia Today is very. I'm sorry.
We want to respond to him too.
Just whatever concluding remarks you want to make.
Okay, then I just wanted to add on. A really good point. So there's a lot of talk about media literacy and the importance for people to understand more about the places from which they're getting information. And, it might sound a little kind of namby-pamby, like we have to teach people in school about how to consume news and information. But I would just say that one response is transparency, that I think people actually have a right to know where they're getting their news and information. And I'm sorry, Chris, I don't think that Russia Today rebanded to RT just for graphics reasons. It did it to make it so that for people who just happen to stumble across the content that, maybe they don't think it's Russia Today. Russia Today is the company that Dmitry Kiselyov runs, but RT is RT. So I favor transparency, and you could actually make a pro-FARA argument in that, if you wish to, back to the point of trying to make their case for them, that by letting people know where information comes from, you help them sort that information and place it properly and give it context. So I'm in favor of transparency as to where information is coming from, and we have no problem with that with our content. We're more than happy to do that. So I think that's a partial answer to the issue you raise.
Maria?
I just had a friend visiting. She's a professor at the University of Exeter at UK. She says plenty of people among her colleagues, professors watching RT have no idea it's Russia Today. They have no idea. There's a reason why Russia Today changed its name, specifically not to let you know where it is coming from, who is funding it. And if you have to defend freedom of press by working at the media that's funded by the openly hostile government, you have a problem. Now, at the early 1990s, there was this belief among the scholars that at the end of history and the availability of free media will just sort it all out and create free, liberal, democratic societies. Guess what? Psychology matters, all kind of things matter. People tend to self-select into bubbles where they have no access and don't want to have any access to alternative viewpoints. Look at Russia. They could have accessed free, independent media if they wanted to, but they like to believe what Putin is telling them because it makes them feel good. And you unfortunately, have to witness that yourself in the US. What is the solution? We have to figure it out. It's not enough just to let it be, because we know for the last 25 years, it has not been enough. Free media was not enough. People self-select. So one potential solution offered by Facebook, where it will be ranking the media depending on the credibility of the source, I think might be a good idea to try. And we have no First Amendment issue here because Facebook is a private company.
Trevor, to the question, short of intervention, regulation, registration, is there anything that can be done?
Sure. Actually, I think the last two questions are sort of intertwined, even though they were completely different. I mean, we have a situation now where our solutions are, okay, are we going to pressure tech companies to narrow the discourse on their sites? It's absolutely true that left-wing sites have seen a precipitous drop in traffic since Google made these changes. And when you would think that they would be in their golden age for traffic, given that Trump is president. And with these Facebook changes, it's going to affect not just sites on the left or on the right, it's going to affect every news organization. Where because Facebook has faced so much scrutiny over the fake news scandal and the election, now they just want to get out of that business altogether. So they are going to emphasize interactions between family, and you're going to have extreme consequences there for not just news organizations, but as the point you mentioned, authoritarian countries around the world using that as an excuse to block and censor and make more content illegal. And so it's a very delicate balance to make, and I don't know if there is a specific answer, but in my opinion, the balance that we have had in the United States with free speech, where we allow vile and hateful and distasteful speech to be legal, is worth it for all of the robust debate and aggressive journalism that is permitted in this country where it isn't in others.
Well, I think we've landed in an important place because, I mean, what you're all describing, what happened in the decline of left-wing publications traffic and the volatility of Facebook algorithms in affecting major broadcasters, it all describes the same monopoly power that these platforms have. And the consequence of it has been, and it's happened very rapidly, that publishers and broadcasters have lost control of their own distribution. So they can't even live inside a small network of like-minded or influential people. They're now dependent on these platforms to reach their audiences and to have a voice. And this, we have to keep reminding ourselves in this industry that this happened very quickly. I mean, even 10, 15 years ago, there was nothing like this structural problem facing people, no matter where they were coming from, as new entrants or as digital publishers. But now it's the world we're in, and I do think it's probably more of an antitrust problem than it is a First Amendment problem. But we'll see what evolves over the next 10 or 20 years. Could you please join me in thanking our panel for their good remarks? Thank you for coming. I wish I could say the bar was open, but it is down on Broadway.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Was this Rachel Moran? Yeah, I put a lot of writers on.